just provide the electricity for people. No shareholders, nothing like that. And they would have some more explicit mandates to help the state meet its climate goals and more accountability measures to report to the state on how they're doing accommodating that transition.
So what's the promise for consumers' pocketbooks?
The promise is mixed and uncertain and complicated. Economic analyses show long-term decreases in rates. So because the new utility would not, again, be able to turn that profit, it would, on the whole, in the long term, lower rates for consumers. That's the expectation. In the short term, there's a lot of uncertainty about how much it will cost to sell the current utilities. That price is not set yet. There's expected to be a lot of debate in court likely about what that price should be, and that could have an effect about whether rates rise in the short term.
Now, who's pushing for this?
The ballot initiative is backed by a number of climate and environmental groups. 350 and the Sierra Club have endorsed it. Bill McKibben has spent time up here in Maine campaigning for the initiative. Maine's environmental groups are really mixed on it. They all seem to agree that there's a lot of uncertainty. They're unhappy with the status quo, where the transition to renewable energy has been slow at times. They're not sure if this will create any less complication, but some of them say, better than business as usual. Some of them say it's not worth the risk. And, generally we've seen the campaign, I think, really pitching itself to younger voters on climate action, on just the dissatisfaction that people have with our current utilities on things like rates and reliability and service. And that's pretty much the pitch to voters, but it's a really mixed bag at this point as to whether it will pass, frankly.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to look at your political prognostication crystal ball and tell us what the results will be, and you're saying, who knows?
Yeah, I think it's gotten more public traction than I think I expected. People are talking about it. It's gotten a ton of just advertising and media attention, maybe more so than I expected initially, when I think some of the press was maybe a little hesitant to touch it, because it is quite a big leap, right? It's a big solution, a big change. But especially in these past few months leading up to the election, there's just been a ton of conversation. It's gotten some national attention, and I think people are starting to hear about it more and realize that they need to form an opinion. But the utilities, the incumbent utilities, have spent millions of dollars. They're outspending supporters about 30-1 right now.
Wait. So the utilities that would get to keep their jobs are spending 30-1 on the public proponent side?
That's correct, yeah. The incumbent utilities, which are Central Maine Power and Versant Power, they're both owned by large foreign-owned corporations, have spent more than $24 million to date on campaigning and advertising, direct mail, a lot of digital ads, and the supporters of the Pine Tree Power Plan have spent, I think, about $850,000 to date. So it's about a 30-1 ratio on spending.
By the way, how would this Pine Tree Power Plan help Maine continue to decarbonize the electricity sector?
So the new utility would have this explicit purpose to help the state meet its climate goals. And Maine has pretty aggressive climate goals. We want to be 80% renewable by 2030. Number of other goals. Maine has pushed really hard for things like heat pumps, and so the new utility will be required to help with those efforts and to report to the state on exactly how it's doing on helping aid those efforts. Maine is deregulated, which means our electric transmission and distribution utilities can't also own power plants. So you can't own both the poles and wires and the power plants. You have to split those up. So the utilities, regardless of their ownership structure, only have so much control over that fuel mix and over renewables adoption. But the experts I've been talking to say transmission utility does have a huge role to play in modernizing the grid and creating a grid that can accommodate all those new renewables and respond to climate change. So they have a huge role to play, a huge amount of investment they need to make in enabling this transition quickly and equitably.
Okay, Annie, before you go, I want you to put on your sociologist hat. What does this election over having a single publicly owned power company, what does it say about how people feel in Maine, about electricity, about the climate crisis, about the role of government in general?
It's a great question. I've thought a lot about this. I really see this election as a statement on who people want as a leader as we undertake this incredibly complex and important transition. Do they want government leadership, public leadership, sort of democratized leadership, or do they trust businesses and whatever version of the free market exists in the energy system and the power of the investment incentive? Do they trust that to lead the charge? It also just says a lot about how broken trust between utilities and regulators and the public can lead to big swings like this in the ballot box. I think a lot of the experts I've talked to have said if you had a state where people were happier with their utilities, where there hadn't been a lot of problems with reliability, where the rates weren't really high, people weren't just sort of overall mistrustful of the incumbent companies, that you wouldn't see it come to something like this. So the ownership structure doesn't inherently address the climate crisis, but it could create more of that public trust and regulatory accountability to ease the transition, especially given just the frustration and kind of log jams we're facing in our current system.
Well, thanks for taking the time with us today. Annie Ropeek is a freelance reporter who's written about this for the Maine Monitor and our media partner, Inside Climate News. Thanks again for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Steve.
And tune in next week to hear about another way to decarbonize the power grid through what are called virtual power plants that rely on smart thermostats, EV batteries, and more.
Hydrogen is getting a lot of attention as a key potential fuel source to replace fossil fuels in the future clean energy economy, because when it's burned, the end product is simply water. With help from funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law, that future may soon be a reality. After a competitive application process, President Biden recently announced the recipients of up to $7 billion in grants for 7 hydrogen hubs across the country. Each hub will include a network of producers, consumers, and transporters of hydrogen, creating a model for what this new energy market might look like. But replacing fossil fuels with hydrogen isn't necessarily guaranteed to bring climate benefits. Here to explain is Nicholas Kuznets, who covered this for our media partner, Inside Climate News. Welcome to Living on Earth, Nick.
Hi, thank you for having me on the show.
What are the Biden administration's goals in creating these hydrogen hubs? Why are they investing this money?
So the hope is that hydrogen could play an important role in helping to cut the nation's climate emissions and climate pollution. And in particular, the hope is that hydrogen could play a role in a number of sectors for which there aren't really good options right now. And in fact, the legislation that created these hubs spelled out some of them. A big one is heavy industry. So things like steel making, you could use hydrogen where the steel plants are currently using natural gas. Hydrogen could also be used for long-haul trucks, and in that case they might be used almost like a battery in something called a fuel cell. Hydrogen could be used to power ships. It could even be used to make like a synthetic jet fuel. So those are, I think, what a lot of people see as some of the most promising or important potential places, but there's few, if any, examples of this happening today, and there's certainly nothing close to the scale that would be needed. So the hubs are meant to start to kind of build a model and test out what works and what doesn't.
So Nick, as you report, not all hydrogen is created equal. Why is that, and what do we know about where these hubs fall in that spectrum?
Sure, there are different ways to make hydrogen, and there is already hydrogen production. Hydrogen is used in oil refining, it's used to make fertilizers, so there's some existing production, and that's almost all made from natural gas in a process that releases a lot of carbon dioxide, so a lot of climate pollution. It's a dirty process, and the hope is that that can be cleaned up, and one way is to do essentially the same process, but to capture the carbon dioxide emissions, to use technology to pull that out of the smokestacks. And that gas could then be compressed and pumped underground. That's become known as blue hydrogen, and that is getting a lot of investment and interest from oil and gas companies in particular, because it uses natural gas, so it would be a new market for their products. But hydrogen can also be made with electricity, and if that electricity is generated by wind or solar power, for example, an emissions-free source, then you can theoretically make zero emissions or extremely low emissions hydrogen by just putting electricity to take the hydrogen out of water. And the hubs are investing in all of this. And there was legislation that said the hubs had to invest in a number of different sources, but some of them are doing a combination. At least 3 of them are going to be making hydrogen with natural gas carbon capture, and so there are more that are using so-called green hydrogen, with renewable energy. The Biden administration said it was 2/3. In some cases, there's hubs that are doing both.
To what extent does blue hydrogen rely on carbon capture technology that actually works?
The only way that you would be able to claim to make clean hydrogen from natural gas is if you captured pretty much all of the carbon dioxide that's released in that process. There are no existing examples of this. There are a couple of hydrogen projects that do have carbon capture operations. They weren't really designed to capture 90+% of this carbon dioxide that comes out of them, which is what you'd need. And so
Really difficult to find in the besieged territory after 3 weeks of Israeli bombardment. And with limited to no access to water, the threat of disease from sanitation problems grows every day. Liz Baker, NPR News, Tel Aviv.
From Tampa, Florida to Chicago to Indianapolis, gun violence has left several young people dead this weekend. Dozens more are hurt. NPR's Amy Hale reports.
In Tampa, at a Halloween celebration, a fight broke out between groups, and so did the gunfire.
We had hundreds of innocent people involved.
Police Chief Lee Burkhaw said early Sunday 2 people were killed, 18 hospitalized. Around the same time in Chicago, someone fired into a crowd, wounding 15 people. And in Indianapolis, a party ended with 1 person shot dead and 9 wounded, victims ranging in age from 16 to 22.
This is just the weekend in the city of Indianapolis.
Simone Burris is with the Metropolitan Police Department.
This is not something we want our community to have to endure.
But more U.S. communities are enduring more mass shootings, nearing 2 per day on average this year, according to the Gun Violence Archive. Amy Held, NPR News.
Services are being held today in Lewiston, Maine to honor the 18 people killed in mass shootings last week. The suspected gunman apparently killed himself. The Republican presidential primary field has just got smaller, while the Democratic field just got bigger. NPR's Mara Liasson has more.
Former Vice President Mike Pence has announced he's suspending his presidential campaign. He was running out of money and polling in the single digits. Despite Pence's impeccable conservative credentials, he had committed what many Republican voters consider a cardinal sin. He refused to obey Donald Trump's request that he overturn the 2020 election. On the Democratic side, Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips is challenging President Biden for the nomination. Phillips' challenge may not defeat Biden, but it could weaken him. Phillips' argument is that Biden is too old and can't win in 2024. In the past, incumbent presidents who face primary challenges go on to lose the general election, like Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. Mara Liasson, NPR News.
This is NPR News from Washington. The president of Kazakhstan declared today a national day of mourning after a deadly coal mine fire yesterday. Officials say at least 42 people died and at least 4 people are still missing. The company that owns the mine and the government are now working towards the company's nationalization after a string of deadly accidents. Investigators say it appears yesterday's fire was caused by an explosion of methane gas. The actor who played Chandler Bing on the popular sitcom Friends is reported to have died this weekend of an apparent drowning at his home in Los Angeles. Matthew Perry was 54. NPR's Neda Ulabi reports on his career.
Matthew Perry was only 24 when he was cast as the snarky, insecure Chandler on Friends.
I'm not great at the advice. Can I interest you in a sarcastic comment?
The show made Perry one of television's biggest and best-paid stars. Perry worked steadily after Friends, often on TV in guest-starring roles. He wrote candidly about his addictions to drugs and alcohol. In a memoir that came out last year, he estimated he'd spent $9 million trying to get sober. And Matthew Perry stayed involved in the recovery community for years, even for a while running a sober house out of his Malibu mansion. Neda Ulubi, NPR News.
Baseball's World Series is tied at 1 game apiece. The Arizona Diamondbacks beat the Texas Rangers 9-1 last night after losing to the Rangers Friday night. The two teams travel to Phoenix for Game 3 tomorrow night. I'm Nora Rahm, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Renewal by Anderson, supporter of the American Cancer Society. Information about Renewal by Anderson's October campaign to help defeat cancer is at renewalbyandersoncares.com.
I'm Lucy May. On the next Cincinnati edition, it's almost Halloween and the pumpkins are everywhere. We've got some advice from our gardening experts for what to do with all those jack-o'-lanterns after you carve them. Plus, remember that cold blast last December that caused so much damage? We'll get tips on protecting your plants ahead of winter. It's a full hour of gardening, Monday at noon on Cincinnati Edition on 91.7 WBXU.
This is the New Yorker Radio Hour, a co-production of WNYC Studios and the New Yorker.
Welcome to the New Yorker Radio Hour. I'm David Remnick. Just days ago, I returned from a trip that took me all over Israel, including what's called Otef Gaza, the Gaza envelope.
This is part of an RPG. Yeah, this is part of an RPG.
This is where 1,000 armed men from Hamas broke through the barriers surrounding the Gaza Strip and carried out a massacre that went on for hour after hour and left 1,400 Israelis dead.
You can see the Kalashnikov, you can see another part of the RPG here. They shot on these safe rooms with all the civilians, the RPG. We were fortunate that most of them were not penetrated by the RPG, but afterwards they broke the doors.
I was escorted by an officer from the Israel Defense Force, the IDF, which was still working to secure the area after the unprecedented collapse.
You know, we have been speaking a lot about the failure, and it was a deep and hurt failure, but we also should discuss the bounce back. But it is the Israeli DNA. Even if you're on the ground, you were hit, bounce back very quickly. What are we hearing? We are hearing the Israeli airborne bombs in Gaza. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You may have read comparisons between the Hamas attack and the historical pogrom known as the Kishinev Massacre more than a century ago in the Russian Empire. Kishinev was one of a great many pogroms in Eastern Europe, but it changed the course of history, convincing many Jews that they could never again be safe in Europe. 49 people were killed at Kishinev. The body count from the October 7th attack is, as I said, over 1,400.
Wait a second. Let me ask you a horrible question.
Yeah.
You know that in parts of the world people will say this is all fake. It's all hasbara.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say to that?
Some people say that the Holocaust didn't exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how do you respond to such people? Truth doesn't matter, okay? I'm standing in front of you. I'm a reliable person. I saved dozens of people in my life, all over the world.
Search and rescue.
Yeah, search and rescue. This is what I do. I have pictures, but these people also, if they would see it in their own eyes, they would say that we faked the situation.
Right.
So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Okay? It doesn't matter. Why should I care of people who choose to believe the evil?
In its shock and rage, Israel has responded with colossal force, with countless airstrikes on Gaza. As I record this, more than 5,000 Palestinians have been killed, according to local authorities in Gaza, linked to Hamas, and the number goes up every day. The Israeli military has cut or reduced the flow of water and electricity, and hospitals are simply not able to cope. There is no sign of a ceasefire. At the same time, Israeli troops have mobilized for a ground invasion into Gaza. There are grave concerns all around the world of a regional confrontation that could involve Hezbollah and Iran. I've been to many places and seen many things, and yet I've never been anywhere where the grief, suffering, rage, and fear are more profound. I'm going to speak today with two keen observers whom I've known for many years, the Israeli journalist Yonit Levy and Sari Nusseibeh, a Palestinian academic and intellectual. We're going to spend most of today's program with them. We'll begin with Yonit Levy. She's the anchor on Israel's leading TV channel, Channel 12, and I spoke with her last week. Yonit, I've just returned from Israel, but you've been anchor for Israel's leading station for 20 years, remarkably. I want to get a sense from you what it's like to be in the country right now.
To be honest, David, it's the worst it has ever been. It's never been this heavy feeling of mourning, really. The whole country is engulfed in that. And when you think of Jewish history, when you think of what we are imbued with, and think of what happened to us in this shock attack of October 7th, then you realize that every single Jewish nightmare came true. And it is a very difficult thing to deal with, quite honestly. With all of Israel's challenges, I think we had this sort of concrete floor of certainty that is sort of pulled from us. And now we question so many things that we haven't had questioned before.
You question what? The very existence of the state?
No, but the ability, most basic ability to have a secure home for your family. Because if terrorists burst into communities and towns and small kibbutzim and murder families in their beds, then the one thing that you as a parent even need to ensure is for them to be secure. So that is the one thing. And this country, you know, exists for that. A large part of it exists for that reason, right? To be a safe haven for Jews in Israel and around the world. And so it is a question of that kind of security, right? Because what happened on October 7th wasn't only a failure of intelligence, it was then, for the other kind of first couple of hours, a failure of operational failure. The families calling in to live television saying, the terrorists are here, where is the military? It took a while.
The killing took place in Otef Aza, the Gaza envelope, the kibbutzim and towns and the music festival right near Gaza, and that's obviously been evacuated. And after visiting those places, I also talked to many of those evacuees in other kibbutzim in the north, and almost none of them said that they would go back and live there again unless Hamas was defeated, utterly defeated. What does that mean?
The Israeli, government and the military is pretty clear on saying Hamas can't rule Gaza anymore, and it can't have the capability to do what it did again. I mean, that should be very clear. The world that is talking about Israel retaliating or Israel's revenge or Israel's rage, this is defense. This is to make sure that what we saw, this massacre, can't happen again. If you're looking at Hamas as a terror organization, so it has a couple of thousand commando units called Nukhba. It has another 25,000 parts of the military arm of Hamas. I'm doing them quite a favor to still make that distinction between the political and the military. So you can go after that, right? And you can say we will topple Hamas's reign of terror in Gaza, so it will never endanger Israelis, and in fact won't threaten the lives of the people in Gaza. But it does speak to larger questions, a little bit, I think, what the United States had to deal with after toppling Saddam, which is, and then what? I think that is also a large question if we reach that point.
You mentioned Iraq, and I think implicitly Joe Biden did when he came to Israel. He showed immediate support for Israel, but at the same time, he very directly counseled against making mistakes out of a sense of rage, out of a sense of lashing out, the way the United States did in the wake of 9/11, particularly in Iraq. Right now, we're seeing a gigantic mobilization around Gaza, countless airstrikes, footage and reports of well over 4,000 people dead already, with more to come. Do you think the specter of a kind of overreaction, a situation in which the stronger nation ends up doing things to defeat itself, is a reality?
I mean, first, the stronger nation was attacked brutally. And I think that whereas Israelis are still, and I think large parts of the Jewish world are still living that attack because the atrocities continue to be uncovered every day, every single day. We are 18 days into this. You know, on one hand, the United States, Joe Biden, the president, saying, you should defeat Hamas, and that should happen, but also, and I think this is very important, under international law. Under international law, tragically doesn't mean that there won't be civilian casualties. So we still, I mean, that moral equivalence that people are now looking at the casualty list and say, oh, there are 1,400 dead in Israel and 4,000 dead in Gaza. That is, I think, a moral equivalence that is wrong to make.
Why?
With all,
Why?
Why? Because Israel, I will explain this. Israel was attacked. Look, this is not another skirmish or another violent cycle. 3,000 terrorists came into Israel, broke down the borders, broke down all of the walls of surrounding communities, had specific targets.
This is a startling collapse of, as many people, Israelis said to me, a collapse of the state, a collapse of surveillance, a collapse of security. What is your sense as a journalist of what happened? Why did this happen? How could it?
There are a few layers here. One is obviously colossal failure of intelligence, because Hamas has been planning this for more than a year. So Israel failed here, and I think the failure, David, is not that the information didn't exist, but that the information wasn't analyzed properly, it wasn't understood. They thought that what they saw behind the fence was an attempt to pressure Israel, an attempt to pressure a part of Hamas that is outside of Gaza, all kinds of things. They didn't understand what they're actually seeing. Occam's razor, right? The simple solution is actually the solution. Because of the intelligence failure and because Hamas managed to blind the bases, the military bases next to the communities, that the military had no idea what the scale of it was. They actually conquered for a few hours something like 20 communities on the Israeli communities on the border, and it took a very long time, by the way. Heroic responses by the civilians themselves in the communities, by the first policemen and soldiers that arrived there, but it took a very long time to actually stop it. Well, in certain kibbutzim it took 8 hours. In certain places it took 24 hours. To this moment, I don't fully understand. I think no one fully understands why it took so long. I think the answer again is that the scale wasn't understood. And I also need to tell you that, again, in Israeli media, the questions are not so much in that area right now. Not that we don't understand that there was a huge, colossal failure, but the military is fighting a war, it might have another front opened up in the north. It feels like, again, to the extent that I could represent the public sentiment, it feels like this is the wrong time to be asking all of those very good questions.
Yonit Levy is chief news anchor on Israel's Channel 12. We'll continue in just a moment. This is the New Yorker Radio Hour.
The New Yorker Radio Hour is supported by NRC Health, who believes that healthcare professionals having an ongoing connection with each patient improves experiences at every touchpoint. nrchealth.com/connect.
Good afternoon. It is currently 12:20 and 59 degrees in Cincinnati. An opportunity to escape from poverty comes in the form of a $10,000 life insurance check for the youngest family. The Cincinnati Black Theater Company's production of A Raisin in the Sun runs through Sunday at Hartsville and Madisonville. Listen to a preview play at WGUC.org.
Here's a friendly reminder to you news junkies out there. WVXU can go with you wherever you go so you remain connected to the tri-state community. Of course, we're on air at 91.7 and 88.5, online at WVXU.org, on your phone or tablet with our mobile app, and by asking your smart speaker to play WVXU.
Hi, it's Steve Inskeep. At Morning Edition, we're honored that people from around the world trust us with their stories.
We are a family that was broken up by migration when my father left.
We need our elders. There are language holders. There are culture sharers.
We need some changes. Things must change.
Join us for Morning Edition from NPR News for stories that bring the news to life.
With host Marianne Zalesnik on 91.7 WVXU.
This is the New Yorker Radio Hour. I'm David Remnick, and I'm speaking today about the conflict in Israel and Gaza with two deeply informed observers on the conflict. We'll continue now with Yonit Levy, one of the most prominent anchors in Israel. I want to ask about the leadership of Israel. For many months, the center of attention has been in the story and on your podcast, has been almost entirely domestic, the judicial reform and the huge demonstrations against it, and that revealed a profound split in Israeli society. And then on October 7th, something happened that many Israelis just describe as a collapse. And at the center of this is someone who's been the prime minister for over a period of time of 16 years, more than David Ben-Gurion, which is Benjamin Netanyahu. Polls now show him in miserable shape. Calls for his resignation. His resignation at a certain point seems almost inevitable. He's under criminal indictment. The country is split, and yet he's there. He's leading this effort. What is the level of criticism against him or confidence in him?
There is definitely a lot of criticism. And as you said, the polls are not good. The polls are done in the middle of a war, so how, that needs to be taken into consideration.
No, but when post 9/11, the polls for George Bush, let's forget Iraq.
True.
2 years later, we're headed towards 90%. Netanyahu's are in the 20s.
That's a good point, but as you already mentioned, Netanyahu arrives at this, and the whole Israeli society arrives into this, or this is forced on us, this war, when we are very divided over Netanyahu's plans for judicial overhaul. The distinction I was trying to make just is to point out that all of the security, all of the IDF establishment, the head of the IDF chief of staff, and the head of military intelligence, and head of Shin Bet, and even the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, all of them said this happened under our watch, and it is our responsibility.
He has not. Netanyahu has not.
He has not.
Why is that?
If I'm trying to dive into his head, I think that he truly believes that he has nothing to do with this, that it was the fault of military intelligence, nothing about his own policies vis-a-vis Gaza. In his mind, I'm trying to describe what he's going through. I don't think he thinks it is at all his fault. He's trying to distance himself.
That seems incredible. That seems
to see
incredible to me, and politically not viable.
I think he is very concerned about the public and the public reaction. There's a lot of rage that is not only because we talked about the failure of intelligence and the operational failure, but after that came the fact that the state of Israel and the different government ministries didn't seem to realize that what we have here is an evacuation of people from their homes, and someone needs to help them. There are tens of thousands of people, who had to be evacuated in the south and in the north, right? Because we're still sort of concerned about what Hezbollah might try and do. And they...
Century. So on the level of policy, Netanyahu seems to
he is receiving criticism on that as well, but I do want to be accurate about one thing. The Israeli establishment, Netanyahu being the head of it for, as you said, a very long time, but also parts of the security establishment. The way that Israel thought, particularly in recent years, to deal with this was to say Hamas is deterred, it doesn't want to start a war, it prefers the improving the lives of its own citizens, so we will placate them with not only money coming in from Qatar, but we will allow for workers to come in from Gaza to work in these southern areas. We will allow for a lot of commodities, and that will keep Hamas quiet. Hamas will give us quiet. So that part is not only Netanyahu, but you're right about the fact that Netanyahu in particular didn't want a strong Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and it was, in a weird way, easier to keep those two separate. By the way, they are separate. There are two separate entities, the West Bank and the Hamas, just in the matter of fact, stems from the fact that Hamas took over Gaza.
The Palestinian issue in recent years seemed almost to disappear from sort of international attention. I mean, obviously pockets of it and various human rights groups were focused on it. How much do you think Hamas was motivated not only by protection of the Al-Aqsa Mosque or political prisoners, but in conjunction with Iran disrupting the entire picture on the Palestinian question?
What you're saying is that they murdered Israeli civilians to get attention?
In some ways. In some ways.
This is a jihadist, Islamist, extreme ideology that is set to annihilate the Jewish state. This is in their charter. They were playing a game with all of us. And that is what they did. I mean, I think that any way of trying to see it other than this is what they intend and this is their ideology. I think we need to start with that.
Unique, there's a view that Hamas is, like it or not, part of the fabric of Palestinian political life. And the only way to make extremism disappear or really diminish would be for a lasting resolution between Israel and Palestinians, whatever that might be.
I think that as someone who has followed this tragedy for decades here in this country, again, we could have had peace a long, long, long time ago if Hamas wasn't involved the way it was. They are the main reason Israelis and Palestinians don't have peace. I think they're also the main reason why parts of Israeli society have moved so far into the right, because in the Israeli state of mind, in the Israeli soul, every time they reached out to try and sign an accord with the Palestinians, it blew up in their faces with terror.
What you're suggesting is that what happened on October 7th and its aftermath will, for a very long time to come, harden positions radically, and a settlement peace in the region is impossible, and the only thing possible is higher walls.
Tragically, walls didn't work on October 7th. It's hard to see beyond, first of all, the next couple of days and weeks for Israelis, to be quite honest. What Hamas attempted to do when you murder children in front of their parents, or parents in front of their children, when you post this on social media, again, you are trying to create this hate for generations. Will we have the power to overcome it? I sadly can't give you a definitive answer on that, David.
We've talked about Joe Biden and his reaction to what happened. We have a complicated country too, and there's been all kinds of different reactions to
I've noticed that.
what's
Very
happened and
complicated
what's
country.
happening. What's your assessment of it from afar?
The feeling is of heartbreak in some way from parts of the West that seem to automatically think in terms like Israel strong, ergo bad, Palestinians weak, ergo good, and this leads to terrible, terrible demonstrations that we've seen. Supporting Hamas, by the way, even before the Israeli Air Force had one plane in the sky over Gaza. That is, that led to a letter, I think a beautiful letter, written, signed by David Grossman and Cynthia Ozick and others, exactly about this sort of heartbreak that they feel when they look at, the inability to just show empathy for what happened to Jews in Israel. So that is one part of how we see it. It's one heartbreak too many.
I know you've spent a lot of time in front of the camera and interviewing people in both studio and closer to where this horror took place and where this ground war seems to be about to take place. I wonder if there's any specific moment, any specific interview that you did, any encounter that you've had in the last few weeks that's just will stay with you to the end of your days.
I don't think I'll ever be able to forget what the kibbutzim looked like after October 7th. We talked about the future of Israelis and Palestinians. Eyal Waldman, whose daughter Danielle and her fiance Noam were murdered at the party. He's someone he's a high-tech entrepreneur in Israel. He built offices in Uabi, in Ramallah, in Gaza. He believes in that. He stood in the studio still during, I think, a few days after his daughter's Shiva, and he said, after all this, we will have to find a way to live together. I thought that was, a moment of someone trying to overcome his grief in such a poignant way. There are so many moments that are very hard. I don't think we'll ever leave me.
Yonit Levy, thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Yonit Levy is the chief news anchor of Israel's Channel 12, and she also records the podcast Unholy with The Guardian's Jonathan Friedland. This is the New Yorker Radio Hour.
The houses in Jabal refugee camp are too small that the street becomes your living room. You hear what your neighbors talk about, smell what they cook. Many lanes are less than a meter wide.
A few days into the Israeli siege of Gaza, we received an essay from a Palestinian writer named Mossab Abu Toa, a poet. He lives in Gaza, and his family took shelter in Jabalia refugee camp. Abu Toa's account is called The View from My Window in Gaza, and he recorded an excerpt for us.
After 2 days in the camp, on Saturday morning, my family has no bread to eat. Israel has cut Gaza's access to electricity, food, water, fuel, and medicine. I look for bakeries, but hundreds of people are queuing outside each one. I remember that 2 days before the escalation, we bought some pita. It is sitting in my fridge in Beit Lahia. I decide to return home, but not to tell my wife or mother, because they would tell me not to go. The bike ride takes me 10 minutes. The only people in the street are walking in the opposite direction, carrying clothes and blankets and food. It is frightening not to see any local children playing marbles or football. This is not my neighborhood, I think to myself. On the main street leading to my house, I find the first of many shocking scenes. A shop where I used to take my children to buy juice and biscuits is in shambles. The freezer, which used to hold ice cream, is now filled with rubble. I smell explosives and maybe flesh. I ride faster. I turn left toward my house.
The poet Mossab Abu Toa, writing in the first days of the siege of Gaza. You can read the view from my window in Gaza in its entirety at NewYorker.com. Years ago, I wrote about a man named Sari Nusseibeh, who's been involved in efforts for peace and a Palestinian state for many, many years. Nusseibeh comes from an old and prominent Jerusalem family, and he's a professor of philosophy, early Islamic philosophy.